Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Carla Trelaw. I'm the Director of the Centre for Social Research in Health at UNSW, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you here. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land and that it always has and always will be. I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present and future, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us here tonight. Thanks so much for coming to this beautiful venue. We're really pleased to have been using this space, for the four years of our sex lecture. And tonight we're talking about sex and drugs. Who thought that would be so popular on a Monday night? So thanks very much for coming. We want to keep the conversation going, so please use the hashtag UNSW Sex Lecture if you're on Twitter. We'll be audio recording tonight's event, so phones on silent, please. There will be an opportunity for questions after our lecture and panel discussion, so get ready for that. And because we're talking about sex and drugs, two things to say. There's a cash bar afterwards. And second, we will be talking about potentially explicit material relating to both sex and drugs together. So we hope that you've assessed that in your decisions to come tonight and listen to that content. So I'm going to introduce first Gary Dowsett, and for many in the room, Gary will need no introduction. He's recently Emeritus Professor at the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, Archers at La Trobe. And we are a sociologist of such a long standing and such importance in the Australian understanding and international understanding of modern gay communities, sexuality and HIV. Gary's a Fellow of the Academy for Social Sciences in Australia and an Adjunct Professorial Fellow with our centre. And importantly, an activist. He was a founding member of ACON, he's a 78er and a life member of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. Please welcome Gary.
Thanks, Carla. I have a confession to make. It was just over 50 years ago that I started taking drugs, and sex was certainly on the agenda. I was a 17-year-old first-year uni student and a fetching puffling itching to come out. A somewhat older postgraduate student decided I was ripe for the picking. The drug was alcohol, and it certainly had an effect. Unfortunately for the postgraduate student, it was not the one she intended. I spent a lot of time hurling out of her car window as she drove me home. The next year I moved into a mixed-sexed, feminist and anti-Vietnam War student household, and our choice of drug was marijuana. I did inhale. I came out that year too, and sex and drugs were involved in pretty much everything. Then I moved on to hallucinogens, and I discovered that Johann Sebastian Bach's music is good for sex. If nothing else, the Brandenburg Concerto lasts a lot longer than a 3-minute Kylie song. And as a gay liberation activist throughout the 70s, for me, sex and drugs and boyfriends, well, it's all a bit of a blur now, because it was all a bit of a blur then. Okay, I'll stop. My simple point is that the relation between sex and drugs and gay men is an old story. Drugs, of course, have a reputation for doing harm as well as providing pleasure. With the onset of the HIV epidemic in the early 80s, sex moved from pleasure to harm as well, and soon gay men's drug and alcohol use was examined as contributing to that harm. We still live with the legacy of that dominant configuration of the connection between sex and drugs. I well remember the first ever World Health Organization meeting in Geneva in 1989 on gay men and AIDS, where I presented the Sydney report. The New York and San Francisco reports noted strong associations between drug and alcohol use and unsafe sex. We hadn't found that in Australia, and not for the want of looking. Those same US researchers later adapted the concept of syndemics to explain continuing HIV infections among gay men. Essentially, the concept positions gay men as damaged goods, thereby explaining drug use, sexual risk-taking, mental health issues, etc., as endogenous to the psychosocial condition of being homosexuals. It's not of much use, really, but it did catch on, just like the more benign idea of minority stress. These kinds of associations start with abjections and have been cemented into the response to the continuing HIV epidemic. They are also evident in today's concerns with crystal meth use and its associations with HIV, sexually transmissible infections and hepatitis C. It is this last association that led to the project we're reporting on today. Much of this phenomenon has been captured by the originally British term chemsex, often framed as risk-taking in the context of sexualised drug use. We don't much like these terms, as we think they often misread what is going on. Of course, we know all drugs can do harm, irrespective of their other effects. Just look at the prescription opiates crisis we are seeing right now. There is also nothing positive to say about tobacco use. Its fleeting pleasures mask inevitable and incontrovertible harms. And we are discovering more serious harms in alcohol use now, particularly in relation to cancer, well beyond dependency issues. We also know drug use is never just about personal pleasure or harm. There are also social harms from domestic violence, road accidents, public aggression, to criminal behaviour, huge profiteering, and indeed all-out armed conflict. Our personal drug use does have broader ethical dimensions. But that's not all that drugs do. There are also great pleasures to be had. Social relations can be created and expressed, with drugs often being a vital aspect of these. 15 years ago, I described gay communities as consisting in sex, love, friendship, belonging, and place, or summarised as sex-based sociality. This idea provided one starting point for our research. Where drugs fit into this sociality now lies at the centre of our research findings, and they are not quite what you might expect. So it will be interesting to hear tonight what you think about what we are now thinking about drugs and sex. So that's it for me. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Max Hopwood. Max is a research fellow at the Centre for Social Research in Health at UNSW. He's a social psychologist with an interest in the social aspects of HIV and hepatitis C prevention, gay men's drug use, and harm reduction. Max has been part of the Sydney lesbian and gay community since 1980, relative newcomer really, and he has done it all, from being a barman at the Bottoms Up bar in the Cross to a Mardi Gras parade marshal. Max is pleased to see these various parts of his life finally come together today in this presentation at Mardi Gras. Max.
Whoa. Thank you, Gary. Look, today I argue that despite many years of research into methamphetamine use among gay and bisexual men, the field largely adheres to individualised biomedical interpretations of the phenomena, which limits the kind of harm reduction that can be made possible and developed into practice. I will contrast findings from public health research with studies conducted by the Centre for Social Research in Health over the past 25 years, including our recently completed study, Crystal, Pleasures and Sex Between Men. Now, over the past 2 decades, there has been a substantial growth in methamphetamine-related research from high-income countries such as Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States of America, with much of this work grounded in the academic disciplines of public health, epidemiology and psychology. This important body of mostly quantitative research has made a significant contribution to scholarship by outlining a range of sex and drug use practices associated with poor health outcomes among gay and bisexual men, including HIV infection. Within public health research, methamphetamine is often portrayed as an inherently risky drug with long-term negative health consequences. Indeed, researchers and authors often reify methamphetamine as a stable, singular and definitive object with well-established harms. In many studies, the use of methamphetamine and other drugs in sexual contexts is understood to increase the likelihood of men engaging in high-risk practices for HIV infection. For example, condomless sex with casual partners. In reproducing this fact about methamphetamine in, for example, introductions to research reports, authors set up the drug as one of the necessary preconditions for producing sexual risk practice. That is, it's the drug's effect on individuals is established as the origin of harmful behaviour. Yet the precise nature of the link between men's meth use and sexual risk practice is poorly defined and imprecisely understood in this work, which has opened the way for assumptions about the link to take hold. The first being that methamphetamine has specific pharmacological properties which lead to disinhibition, risky sexual behaviours and poor health outcomes. The second explanation is that meth attracts men who are already inclined towards highly sexualised interactions and risk-taking, and that such men are likely to engage in risk practice with or without drugs. Now, these two dominant public health narratives describing a wicked drug or undisciplined people are focused entirely upon individuals, which my colleagues and I argue has limited the way that sexualised drug use is understood. And in turn, this focus has restricted the types of responses that are developed to reduce methamphetamine-related harm to individualised interventions such as cognitive behavioural therapy, motivational interviewing, and contingency management, which all demonstrate limited beneficial results in Cochrane reviews. The two narratives of a wicked drug or undisciplined people are mainly derived from cross-sectional quantitative research methods and a medicalised engagement with different forms of drug use. On the one hand, statistical associations described in these studies do not prove that methamphetamine causes HIV infection. While variables in cross-sectional studies can be correlated statistically, they cannot be causally linked. Patterns and practices of meth use cannot be said to lead to certain sexual practices. Many authors acknowledge this methodological limitation, yet on the other hand, slippages in attributing causation still often occur. Slippages in attributing causation also inform findings of some descriptive qualitative research studies in public health, which also tend to focus upon the negative consequences of meth use. Published qualitative studies do not always contain a clearly defined theoretical framework to organise and analyse men's sex and drug use practices and their decision-making, and consequently the findings often reproduce assumptions about attributions of causation. So poorly supported assumptions, conceptual slippages of attribution, and poorly defined constructs mean that other researchers and consumers of research often reproduce such shortcomings in subsequent work. Recently, critical social science scholars have highlighted how individualised public health research findings tend to inflate problems associated with methamphetamine use and exclude other aspects of the drug use experience. A rush to risk reflects a preoccupation within biomedical research more generally to deny or simply to overlook the social, historical and political contexts in which meth use and sex occurs, and to deny or overlook the pleasures of sex and drug use that are derived by some gay men. Indeed, the literature often overlooks variations in the settings where drug use occurs, the different forms of methamphetamine used. Is it base, is it powder, or is it crystal? The different ways the drug is administered. Is it injected? Is it ingested or swallowed or smoked? How often methamphetamine is used? And the impact of polydrug use. These differences imply more or less harms. However, most studies in this field fail to consider their relative impacts. In a few that have, it is the regular injection of crystal meth that is associated with higher levels of harm, including an elevated risk of dependence, of mental health problems, and of participating in risky sexual practices. But an absence of nuanced and rigorous exploration within public health research perpetuates a popular view that methamphetamine is essentially a wicked drug, and that any meth use is inherently harmful. These views persist throughout the literature with few exceptions. By attributing sex on meth to a dangerous drug or bad individuals, the social, historical and political contexts in which drug-enhanced sex occurs are removed. While we acknowledge that specific patterns and ways of using methamphetamine can be riskier than others, the findings of studies from the Centre for Social Research in Health trouble the view that all meth use is problematic and that sex on drugs in general is always risky. The findings from our studies in this area highlight the numerous strategies that gay and bisexual men implement to reduce harm and to maximise pleasure. In contrast to previous public health research, our studies show that men's patterns of meth use and sexual practice are not simply the result of pharmacological properties of a wicked drug, nor are they an outcome of undisciplined people. On the contrary, our findings indicate that for many gay and bisexual men, meth and other drug use is historically and culturally grounded within sex-based sociality and is a means of building pleasurable and social sexual connections with other men. Our studies in this area have mostly used qualitative methods, so the samples are not representative and the findings are not generalisable, yet they are instructive. For the Crystal Pleasures and Sex Between Men study, we interviewed a total of 123 people, including 88 gay and bisexual men and 35 key informants from Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth. And from here on, I will refer to methamphetamine as crystal because the crystalline form of the drug was the most common form available in these 4 Australian cities. We analysed our data through the lens of social practice theories, which account for the social, historical and political aspects of men's sexual practice and crystal and other drug use. Our analysis used a strengths-based approach to identify harm reduction strategies and other care practices. This is not to deny that some people have difficulties with crystal use. However, we were interested in the ways that men manage their patterns of use and sexual risk. In contrast to findings reported in the public health research, where HIV infection is often assumed to be the greatest concern of gay and bisexual men who have sex on crystal, men in our recent study viewed, in their words, addiction to be their primary concern. That is, men worried about a creeping dependence on crystal, as well as becoming dependent on the kinds of sex that they had on crystal. Men in our study talked about the challenge of managing their patterns of crystal use and sexual practice. Some feared the reputational damage or the anticipated stigma that comes with being perceived by others as out of control on drugs. Our data contained a range of reports from men who said their crystal use and sexual practice felt unmanageable, to those who said they had maintained or regained a sense of control over their practices. We did not define controlled drug use in our study. Instead, men reported on whether they felt able to manage and control their own patterns of use. So mostly, in our study, men aimed to maintain a pattern of crystal use that was both pleasurable and controllable. Participants reported that one of the most effective ways to control their use was to limit the frequency of use via a range of strategies, such as having diverse social and sexual networks, including people who do not use crystal, having access to information about safer crystal use from community-based organisations and from friendly health professionals, implementing avoidance strategies around factors that might trigger use, such as cutting back on using social media hookup apps for a period, and relocating to areas away from using networks for a period. Our participants included professionals in full-time employment who described work as a protective factor against escalating drug use. And one gentleman said, "Yeah, we managed it. We were both professionals. We both had to work, and you realise if you go too hard, you can't go into work. You've got to call in sick and you won't be able to do that." So there is a time period. I think some people may start the management by they play on the Friday evening, so they've got the weekend to recover before they go to work on Monday. We also spoke to workers doing rotations in remote areas. Some said that paid work helped to limit opportunities for using, as did working in industries with drug testing regimes, where extended periods of abstinence were required, as described by a young gay man who was employed in the mines. He said he liked to be in control of his drug use to experience the pleasures of losing control. So I'll spend 12 weeks of my life working my arse off to be able to have 5 or 7 days off my head, and that's the choice that I make, rather than going to Bali. Men wanted to enjoy sex with and without crystal, and some acted to limit or disconnect crystal and sex from their lives. They were aware that patterns of use could easily escalate over time, which could diminish their enjoyment of sexual practice, interfere with their relationships and affect their health, as reported here. One man says, "I was quite happy with the fact that I would sometimes have it, but I wouldn't actually have it all, and therefore it would just last and would space out quite a bit. That hasn't been the case of late, so my concern is what's happening there. Am I becoming tolerant or dependent? I'm a bit concerned about what is going on in that space for me." While HIV prevention was said to be important, being able to manage and control crystal use was also a major priority. That HIV infection was only one of several concerns for participants is not surprising, given that these data were collected during a time when pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, was becoming widely available. Key informants in each of the 4 cities were also concerned about HIV prevention, but they were just as concerned about a range of social impacts from crystal use, such as stigmatisation. Crystal-related stigma was said to affect queer community cohesion, and stigma could also inhibit gay men from assessing treatment for crystal dependence from mainstream drug and alcohol services. Now, to help manage their crystal use, men in our study drew upon formal health promotion information disseminated by queer community and drug user organisations, as well as drawing upon informal network-based knowledges about drug use. These formal and experiential sources of information informed care practices for gay and bisexual men, and constituted a communitarian counter-public health, which has been identified in earlier work conducted by researchers originally from our centre, namely Kane Race and Erica Southgate. Back in 1997, I worked with Erica on a qualitative study of gay men's drug use, which focused mostly upon ecstasy and the 1990s Sydney queer dance party scene. In that study, the safer consumption of drugs was a form of cultural capital and was socially modelled by experienced users. In this earlier work, we identified people in gay men's drug-using networks who acted as lay experts in harm reduction, including older gay men, queer women, and heterosexual women. At the time, we called these people network nannies because they acted out of concern for the safety and enjoyment of their peers. Nannies were the keepers of local gay community folk knowledges about drug use, including a folk pharmacology. Network nannies sometimes had backgrounds in health, so their harm reduction strategies were informed by medical education, but also by personal experiences of drug use. Nannies would attend dance parties carrying supplies from Band-Aids to antipsychotics in their bum bag. They encouraged friends to test drive their drugs before taking a full dose. They taught friends in their network how to sequence different drugs to maximise the pleasure of sex and a big night out. They knew how to pace and choreograph drug use to avoid dangerous contraindications, and they taught safer injecting practices to friends. Over 20 years later, we again identified lay experts and folk knowledges that constituted a communitarian counter-public health in the crystal, pleasures and sex between men study. We spoke to participants who felt a responsibility to share information within their sexual and social networks to reduce the harms of their crystal use. They provided advice ranging from sex party etiquette to a folk pharmacology about how to come down after long sessions, about sequencing, pacing and choreographing polydrug use, and about avoiding detection by drug testing regimes. Likewise, men who use crystal within sexual subcultures such as BDSM mentored less experienced men into safer sex and drug practices, and men who were experienced at injecting spread safer injecting information among their peers in sexual networks. For example, about how to make veins more accessible. One of our recent network nannies said, when it came to injecting, it kind of always felt like no one knows how to use a swab properly. And I used to be like, hey, funny fact. And everyone would just like jab away. And I'm like, hey, how about we just have a shower and some water and maybe do a few sit-ups, push-ups, and it'll be fine. The folk knowledges that we used in these studies to build social connection, to promote control, to avoid dependence, to assist coming down, to initiate new sexual practice, to pass drug tests, and to increase safer injecting, are a compendium of formal harm reduction and experiential knowledge, derived from the social, political, and cultural aspects of living, loving, and partying within queer communities. So, to briefly summarise, findings from public health research have been invaluable for describing risk associated with crystal use. However, there is more to learn about crystal use than is currently provided through this paradigm. Our study findings support an argument for a greater inclusion of men's experiential knowledge and the role of pleasure in analyses of crystal use and sexual practice. Importantly, the work of community-based organisations, including drug user organisations, have helped shape safer sex and drug use practices among gay and bisexual men in a difficult political and legal context of drug prohibition. For many gay and bisexual men, methamphetamine use is historically and culturally grounded within sex-based sociality and is a means of building pleasurable sexual and social connections with other gay men. Just before I finish, I'd like to particularly thank Associate Professor Joanne Bryant for her fabulous input into this study over the last few years. And of course, thanks to our study collaborators who have been wonderful to work with during the time this study has been running. So thank you for listening to me and have a very happy Mardi Gras.
Thanks, Max. Just so much, if that's where you are, so much great stuff to unpack there. And we will have a second part to this series. But before we go there, I did want to just acknowledge Bill Botel, who's in the audience, and Michael Kirby, who are terrific supporters of our centres. And it was in discussion about 5 years ago, the idea of doing this type of sex lecture came up, with the idea that, we do great stuff and we have normal channels of disseminating and talking about this, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a way to bring our research to life in the community and to engage community members, health practitioners, policymakers in really unpacking and thinking about what that research could become next. So thank you, Bill. I know you're in the audience, though I have no idea where you are. We really appreciate the support, ongoing support from you and Michael. So in the next part of the session is going to be driven by Karen Drysdale. And Karen's a research fellow with us at the Centre for Social Research and Health, and her disciplinary background is in cultural studies. You may have seen her recent book, Drag Kings. It's out, go and buy it, it's hardcover. Saw someone balancing their coffee on it on Twitter in bed the other day. You know, it has multiple uses. So in cultural studies, Karen has a particular focus on gender and sexuality diverse social scenes, identities and practices, including drug use. So Karen's going to take us into the panel discussion, but also to talk about what we did next with these data, which refers to what's on the slide. So welcome, Karen.
Hi everyone out there. Okay, so thank you Max for such a fascinating, wherever you are, for such a fascinating lecture, and to Carla for the very kind introduction. Now, you may have heard something playing over the loudspeakers as you entered the theatre today. One thing that we're very proud of from the Crystal Pleasures and Sex Between Men project is our research, translation and dissemination efforts. Now, in particular, I'm talking about a series of 3 podcasts called Crystal Clear. It was the trailers for those podcasts that you heard as you came in. Throughout our research in this study, we identified some serious gaps in knowledge of and access to services for crystal use, especially when it's related to sex. This suggested to us that the knowledge about harm reduction and health promotion was potentially uneven across the various networks in which men used. And this extended to those in our communities who know and support guys who are using crystal for sex. And so the team felt that podcasts might provide one avenue of addressing these gaps, to provide a multi-platform opportunity to disseminate health promotion and harm reduction strategies through conveying personal stories that privilege people's own experiences. So we identified 3 themes and 3 target audiences that we felt would most benefit from this information. First, we wanted to convey some of the strategies that gay and bisexual men can use to manage their crystal use and to relay messages around opportunities for early intervention and resourcing. Second, we felt it was important to identify the needs of people who support gay and bisexual men using crystal and how those people can also be supported. And finally, we aim to promote workforce development and engagement between health promotion, harm reduction and AOD sectors in response. So we took data from this research and we asked people with various lived experience and expertise in these areas to comment. And in this way, we draw upon the strengths of community and health services to focus attention on the issues relevant to these audiences. So please check them out and let us know what you think about them. You can follow the QR code on the screen on the left. It will take you to SoundCloud. Hit follow or bookmark the page so you've always got them available. The other QR code on the right will take you to a list of our publications that have arisen from this research, including a brand new article that just came out this weekend. So we'll also play the trailers as you leave the theatre today, so please listen out. At this point, if we could raise the house lights for the stage, I'd like to introduce our panellists to take their place. This is very exciting. We have some amazing people. All rushing to take their seats. Okay, so first off, we have Leon Fernandez. Leon is a harm reduction expert and adult educator for over 20 years. He has intimate knowledge of illicit and injecting drug use and its relationship to sex. Joel Murray is a queer person living with HIV. Their experience is both professional, having worked as a senior policy advisor on the Special Commission of Inquiry into the drug ICE, and personal, having the lived experience of substance use and supporting people who use substances in the context of sex. And finally, Dr. Susie Hudson. She's an accredited mental health social worker with over 20 years clinical experience and is the clinical director at NADA, as well as maintaining a private counselling and clinical supervision practice. So I'm just going to move over here and join you all. Those of you in the audience may also comment that I very rarely wear dresses. I've just also realised one of the disadvantages in wearing a dress on Okay, so the Crystal Pleasures and Sex Between Men project revealed some really interesting findings, especially when compared to those from traditional public health approaches. And we can see that many of these differences lie in how risk is understood and approached, both in research, policy and in practice. Now, there's clearly benefits from research that identifies associations between risk practices and poor health outcomes. But equally, I think you'll all agree with me that there are benefits from research that explores how men collectively manage those risks and understanding how and why their social and sexual world might offer protection from against developing harmful practices. So I think it's really important then that we can have some really open, frank, potentially a little bit explicit conversation around crystal use for sex, because we really need to sort of break through this kind of stigmatising barrier that is precisely those reasons why we identified those gaps in knowledge amongst our participants. So I've surrounded myself here on stage with some pretty exceptional people, and what I want to do in this conversation is bring out some of those complexities
some of those complexities into focus and how we can maybe think of alternative ways to approach this. Okay, so I'd like to put it to you, my panellists. How can we remain open to the variability and contingency of settings, relations and practices of gay and bisexual men who use crystal for sex? And how can we allow for more complexity in how we view and respond to their particular needs? So first off, let's listen to what Leon has to say as someone with lived experience of these very issues we're talking about.
That was a question?
That's my question. This is your moment to...
That was quite complex. Can you make it more simple?
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks.
In your particular lived experience
Yep.
of using crystal for sex,
Yep.
what are some of the limitations in the way that this has been traditionally framed for you?
Okay.
What have you got to say about it?
I've got a lot to say about that. Do you want, oh gosh. Getting high and having sex can be an absolutely beautiful experience, and I can't doubt that. Getting high and having sex can be a troubling and difficult experience. The idea of crystal being a wicked drug is ridiculous. Molecules, as far as I'm aware, don't have a moral kind of code, so I think that's ridiculous, but not to belittle people who've had terrible experiences, wicked experiences on those drugs. The way we talk about this is stupid. The way we talk about the wicked drug, the undisciplined person, that sort of thing, is not helpful in any way. And the implication of wicked drug is that it's wicked people who use them. And we've had enough fucking morality attached to being gay and being bi and all that sort of stuff that we don't need that attached to drug use. It's I've had enough of it, and I think we'll have.
Yeah, I've supported a lot of people, particularly because I've talked publicly about my own lived experiences, and so then community members do feel comfortable in coming to me to discuss their own use. And what I often hear is that people think that there is sort of an inevitable trajectory of use, that you start off using recreationally and that you end up in dependence and needing treatment. And what I try to tell people or comfort people is that actually that's not the case. And we've got a lot of data from different research that suggests that. But when it comes to supporting people and even me supporting supporters of people who are supporting, sorry, I just got confused then, is that we don't always have the capacity to support people. It really, particularly if you've got your own lived experience of substance use, I think it's really important that I practice self-care around that, and I'm really clear about my boundaries and communicating when, for example, I might be triggered, having a moment where I feel triggered in my personal life, and to be able to communicate that in a way to the person who I'm trying to support without making them feel bad about it is really important.
I mean, I think it's incredible to actually hear a different kind of narrative, that we know has been out there, but certainly what we know is that people take from the research and then try to translate that into practice. And what often ends up happening is, particularly for men that I've seen and from experiences of some of the people that provide treatment, is that it's, without talking about the pleasures associated with this drug, we silence that aspect of somebody. And then if they indeed are concerned, then it obviously keeps them away from reaching out for that support if indeed they'd like that. Certainly in my experience, when people have come along, certainly older gay men who have really utilised crystal to reconnect with the scene, perhaps to explore their sexuality in ways that they weren't able to before. Unfortunately, when they come to seek some support, there's a huge amount of shame and stigma. And in fact, a lot of the work then becomes around unpicking that and how that's sort of become welded to their own sexuality and how they've experienced that. And so I suppose what comes through for me very strongly is, if we're going to support people, the first thing we need to be doing is to break down that stigma, to appreciate it in all its forms and benefits, and so that if indeed people do feel like things are getting a little bit hairy, that they're actually able to reach out in those moments. Particularly for this drug, what we know is because of that stigma and not acknowledging the pleasure and the connections and the exploration that people have utilised the drug for, we've actually meant that when people are worried, they've waited a long time to reach out for support, which can compound that experience.
Oh, absolutely. I think the one thing that we could probably just agree on right now is that not all drug use is problematic and in need of intervention, and that people have some really well-connected cultures of care that they operate within and the drug and sex practices take place within. But stigma is a massive barrier to seeking help, and it's 100% evident in our findings that this idea that AOD services are only available for people who self-identify as having problematic use, as being an addict. And it just doesn't, it elides the idea that there are so many early intervention opportunities available to people, both through informal and through formal means as well. So what I want to do now is maybe ask a little bit more about the harm reduction and health promotion work in this area, given the range of issues that we've just spoken about. So, Leon, we've made it clear that you are neither an undisciplined person, nor do you use a wicked drug. So what are the implications for gay and bisexual men to be described of in those terms, and what alternatives do you want to see? What types of harm reduction resources do you want available to you?
As I clearly kind of argued, the idea of a wicked drug is ridiculous. The idea of an undisciplined person is ridiculous. In my hiatus of using crystal, I happened to hold down 3 mortgages, and I'm not a trust fund kid. I was a community worker, and do a lot of stuff, work full time, and use crystal quite a lot. So the harm reduction messages, we need stigma reduction techniques and messages, and that's why we talk about this stuff. That's the fucking mass media campaigns which are an absolute waste of money to make these huge campaigns about a very niche problem amongst people. We need people to be aware that most people who use crystal will not become addicted. We need people to be aware that with these ideas that it's a wicked drug, you're undisciplined, people can self-identify, or it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Fuck, I've injected crystal, my life has fallen apart, I'm going to be in the gutter. And we need to do those sorts of things. We need to fund health services so there's many points along the path that people can actually seek someone and be intervened. We need to teach people how to inject themselves or inject each other. I get it when people don't want to inject themselves and blah, blah, blah. And I'm happy to help out with that stuff if their veins are good enough. So we need to take care of each other too. We're in this tribe together. We need to not rip each other off. We need to take care. We need to be respectful of when people don't want to use. And we need to be respectful of when they do as well. We need needle exchanges, obviously. We need Hep C treatment. It is a modern miracle how Hep C treatment looks. Anything else?
Oh, I think we've got a fair amount there.
Right.
I think it's very clear that stigma is a recurring kind of theme that's coming out here. And that's really important. And it was interesting in our research, despite the prevalence of the NSP programs across the different states, some men in our study hadn't heard of an NSP, and they were accessing things from chemists and then reusing because they'd paid so much for them. And that's a really problematic kind of thing. We need to make sure that we increase public awareness around these services because they are out there. And you're 100% correct with that notion that we must also have non-abstinent based process or services out there as well that people can check in with their use. Now I want to turn to...
Can I just make a quick point about distribution and equipment? Even though my use is very infrequent these days for crystal meth and injecting, I always have a drawer full of clean equipment and the range of what people might need, so that and it's been a case where I've been talking to someone on one of the online apps and they're like, oh, do you know where I can get equipment? And I'm like, well, just drop around and I'll give you a 10-pack. And that's, currently peer distribution is illegal, so we need probably some law reform around that.
It's Joel, our nanny. Susie, I wanted to ask you actually how you and the treatment services that NADA represent will interpret these study findings, and what's useful for healthcare professionals who might be here to know in respect to this issue.
Well, I think that actually the drug and alcohol service system has really evolved a lot. We've still got a long way to go, and a lot of that can be enhanced by listening to lived experience. I think that's first and foremost what we can do better about, is really listening to people about what they want. How is it that treatment can be wrapped around them as opposed to them fitting into the treatment? And I think a lot of services have got really much better at that. We've certainly at NADA been really heavily promoting that people ask the question about people's gender diversity, about people's sexuality, so that they can see that person as a whole person, that they can talk to them about whether or not this is the best service for them, and if not, where they can actually link in with peers or other more appropriate services for them. But I think that, it's really about hearing what it is that people want. It's absolutely having choice. What is it that you might want today might not be what you need tomorrow. And certainly that we're also being really inclusive of not just that person who may or may not be in a position where they might be interested in continuing their use, they're not concerned about their use, but maybe we can support those who may be concerned about their use. So that can be a really valid and reasonable thing that treatment providers can do, is to help the person who's worried about somebody else's use. Because I think, we need to get, much more creative around how support services are provided. But most importantly, I suppose, is signalling to anybody that this could be a safe place for them. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done in that space. Not just that we ask the questions, but that we have the right responses and that we can make people feel safe. And at the same time, that whenever we're talking with people, that we ask about the role that a substance plays in someone's life. And that really then points a lot more to maybe they're not actually here because they're concerned about their drug use, or maybe the drug use feels like it's getting overwhelming, but actually maybe there's something else that's going on for that person. And that once they get some of those bits and pieces sorted, actually the substance use gets back to a much more manageable level. And certainly a lot of the people that I've worked alongside, it's when work's getting too overwhelming, they feel stressed out, they need time out, and you know what? Methamphetamine works for those moments. It's a modern drug in a modern age where it allows you to have more sex, get more done, do more study. So I think we need to be realistic about what is the role that a substance plays in someone's life, and then we get a much better appreciation for the ways in which we might respond and provide support if it's needed.
Absolutely. I was fascinated recently reading the history of meth in the States. And its really productive capacity that was put to it. And it was only when unemployment rose that it became a non-productive substance. Now, I've got a really good question for you, Joel. I want to know just how well the wider social, historical and political contexts are understood within harm reduction and health promotion for gay and bisexual men. But I also want to ask you about the potential implications that this has for other gender and sexuality diverse people who may use drugs as well.
That's what a great question. So in terms of like the social, political and cultural phenomenon or practices of sexualised drug use, I think within our community they're fairly well understood, particularly among networks of people who engage in those practices. But if you kind of step outside of that, that kind of contextualisation people don't get it. I've certainly been in situations where I was like seeking support or seeking to maybe just like reduce my use, but as soon as you throw, like I was in a group situation, and as soon as I was talking about injecting and sex, like it was like I just got stigmatized completely. It wasn't very beneficial. In terms of the diversity of sexuality and gender diversity, it's not just gay and bisexual men that engage in sexualized drug use. Certainly we have data around women, queer women and non-binary people engaging in sexualized drug use, as well as people who identify as transgender. But what we don't really have is data around their patterns of use. So we understand maybe some prevalence stuff, but we don't actually know how often they're using it or what contexts they're using it, or and certainly I've heard that from some of the members in our community that some people use substances very planned, some use them more spontaneously or opportunistically, which, you know, I think the different contexts may have different implications for harm reduction.
Absolutely. I think that's the thing that we need to be cognizant of, that there are certain specificities that are in relation to gay and bisexual men's use of meth, especially meth for sex. But there's also some commonalities that we can draw upon as well. And we can look at those ethos of care that has had that long history in gay drug using cultures and see where they might exist or where the potential for them to exist is in other cultures as well.
And can I say heterosexual people also have sex and drugs? No.
Absolutely, yes. Controversial point. Except that, you know, the queer community often do it better. I think at this point we've got a few more minutes for some questions from the audience. If anyone has a burning question that they would like to ask of our panellists, we might put the lights up for the audience if we can, so we can see. Oh, wow, look at you all. Hi, everyone.
First, I want to just, I just want to let you know that, you know, I've been working in the field for the past decade, and I love this opportunity actually to hear, you know, everyone's perspective about this and how it's working. So I work in the field and primarily with chemisex presentation, and I'm just wondering about because as I'm going to talk here, I feel very responsible for talking because I'm talking about my community. But also I don't want to further stigmatize a community that fights so much to get the rights they have there. But also we need to actually talk about the potent drug itself. We talk about synthetic drugs, and we talk about how that can impair, you know, the dopamine receptor with long time, just to get this information. How to get this information, but not stigmatize. This is a very fine line that we have to do that. And I think just what I feel as well is just because I work with the clients, I work with the long-term clients for a long time. And sometimes retention itself is a very, very difficult thing to do it. And a lot of my clients will say to me, I wanted to have some control and I wanted to use on the weekends. Okay, that's good. But then I have to explain to them about, because of the potent drugs, how you're going to be depleted for the next almost 2 weeks. And then the person go to work, and then he start to have other problems of this. My job is to give you psychoeducation, the short, the long effect. How can we do a little bit about that? So there is part as well. There is a part that when we see a lot of clients says that to me that you know, I don't have any problem because they have a comparison of someone who uses way much more not using. But I give you a little the analogy of the iceberg, you know, the iceberg thing. So you just see the top, you don't see how the struggle people is. So it's very difficult to have a role play of someone who is just navigating under the surface, but having a little problem how to identify early to do that. And I agree what you're just saying about advertise, show the worst case scenario. And if I do have a problem and I see the worst case scenario, this doesn't incline to me.
Yeah.
So it's how we do that.
Yeah. So I think community-based resources that have been produced by the community that they're targeted at is a great start. I will commend the Institute of Many for putting together a really fantastic resource a few years ago called Turning Tina. And what that did is it kind of had a series of sort of red flags almost, so that, or a checklist, so that someone could go through and be like, oh, is this sort of happening? Am I calling in sick to work on Monday? Or am I not, telling friends making an appointment and then cancelling later? Just little things that might be
And they were written in the language of the men who used it as well. So it wasn't written in clinical language. It was written the same way that your mate would talk to you about it, which I think is a really important way to disseminate information.
Yeah, and I think, developments like St Vincent's Hospital getting involved in producing the S-Check app, which will be out fairly shortly, once again speaks to this idea of being able to just check in and make sure that you're doing okay, like a health check, and not to step away from the judgment about where you might be at, but more importantly, just to be able to say, how am I going, and really think about that for yourself, about what's good for you at any one time.
Do you have anything to add there, Leon?
No.
Okay. And I think, the other point I think that's really important to raise is just because someone sees you on one day with particular needs, that those needs may change the next day as well. And so you can't sort of assume that there's going to be some kind of progressive decline in health around drug use. So you need to find where they are at that particular point and make sure their needs are met. Are there any other questions? I can't. Yep, you've got one there.
Sure. Yeah, I've noticed a lot of judgment from, moralising and judgment from particularly younger gay men within our community, but also other people, about casual sex and about drug use. And it seems to have come about at around about the same time as the debate about marriage equality, although I'd hate to say it was all about that. But I wonder, how do we as a community respond to that kind of stigma from within our own community directed at us?
Go to Leon with that one.
I'll give it a crack, because that is a really complicated one. There's the good junkies and the bad junkies. The good junkies have injected for 20 years and they've never got Hep C or HIV. The bad junkie, the good poofters get married and get dogs, and the bad poofters, we just fuck each other. So yeah, there's a huge amount of morality which has been ingrained since our religious shit has raised us. My answer, I don't know. I think we need to just be aware of it and take care of each other, however fluffy that means. But be aware that these ideas do get perpetuated. And I think there is a point about marriage equality that did bring up the good gay and the bad gay and the married gay and all that sort of stuff too.
I think we also need to privilege as many voices and as many experiences around this as possible, so that people understand that there's no single, gay guy who's using drugs, good or bad, and that we need to have that array to understand the diversity of experience.
We're not homogenous in our thinking or our political views or our cultural tastes or our sexual pleasures. So to expect that, a gay guy looks like this, does this, I think that's quite unrealistic. But I think maybe it's the naivety of youth. As we get older, I certainly have a completely different view about our community than I did when I was a baby twink.
Yeah. And I just want to also reiterate that our study findings, we had participants who ranged from 21 years old to I think 74. So we definitely, I felt, captured a range of maybe potential generational differences in there. Are there any other questions? Yep.
Thank you. I had a quick question about the research. Max said there were 35 key informers who made up part of the study sample. I was wondering who those people were and what role they played in the study.
Sure. I might thank you. So the key informants came from a range of services. They were people from CEOs down to service provider levels, working in AOD, in harm reduction organisations, drug advocacy or user organisations, sexual health sites, and as well as policy makers as well from various policy arenas. We purposefully cast the net wide to get as many views as possible. And it was really interesting that these key informants had, in some ways, some particular views that did resonate with the types of findings we found from gay and bisexual men, but in other ways were quite divergent, suggesting that in some cases that some of that knowledge might be a bit removed from what's happening on the ground or in practice. Does that answer the question? Yep.
Firstly, can I just ask for a bit of gender equality and call me a granddaddy in the saying rather than a nanny? It'd be nice.
Of course, okay.
My concern is the use of drugs to actually get people into a non-consensual space. I think we use non-consensual. I really think that that's watering down what I would call assault, sexual assault in our community, and it is something that we haven't kind of really raised as a general community. I think it goes into the way that we stigmatise each other. It's not just about young people talking about older people, it's older people talking about younger people's behaviour as well. So I think in terms of that, we need to kind of be very honest with ourselves about what's going on in our community. And I do see the pointy end of this, and I do see the people who have been assaulted, the fear, and the lack of support that's been provided. So I'm just wondering, what is it that you've kind of seen, or have you run into this into your research? And as a community, really, what are we going to do about this?
Well, we have certainly seen in our research findings that there were some very serious harms associated with crystal use, including non-consensual sexual encounters, and that is a massive problem. And we have to acknowledge that there are harms associated with crystal use. But the problem is that if we just simply see it from a risk perspective, is that we miss out on the ways that we can intervene in the way that stigma prevents men from seeking help when they do find themselves in those circumstances.
When I was living in Melbourne, one of the sex on premises venues decided that they were going to start ID checking scanning everyone's ID, and they stated that it was in response to an increase in reporting of sexual assault and substance use. Now, as someone who has experienced sexual assault while using substances in an SOPV, and in fact it was that particular SOPV, I thought, well, this is actually probably not the best way to do it, is to start taking people's IDs. What might have been a better way is to do some health literacy or health promotion around what people's rights are, asking, telling people that it's okay to go and report to the police that this has occurred, or to report to community organisations to help do the advocacy on, my behalf or the victim's behalf. I think there are some things that we can do and some conversations we need to have, but I think they're going to be difficult conversations that they still need to happen nonetheless.
Yeah. We definitely need to have those difficult conversations. We are out of time. So what I would like to do at the moment is to thank our speakers, that's Carla, Gary and Max, and our amazing panellists, Leon, Joel and Susie. I'd also like to thank Adita, Annie and the other CSRH colleagues for bringing this event together again. I'd also like to thank Eternity Theatre for hosting this lecture, and to ACON and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at UNSW for the sponsorship of the event. And most importantly, I'd like to thank you for all coming along the day after Fair Day on a Monday night. The cash bar is open downstairs as we speak, and perhaps you might find some of these panellists hanging around and you can ask any further questions that you have. And also have a listen to the trailers on the way out, and don't forget to use the QR code to access them. Thank you very much.